Inherited scars. There are secrets hidden deep within a family's bloodline, pains passed down from generation to generation that no words can fully express. They are invisible scars, sometimes hidden beneath a facade of peace, until they erupt into horrifying tragedies. Today, we will delve into a series of shocking murders where the perpetrator is not a stranger, but a family member. But what's even more terrifying is the chilling repetition in the modus operandi, as if a curse is being passed down, an act of violence inherited through different fates. This is not just a story about crime, but a dissection of deep psychological traumas, the inheritance of violence, and a mysterious puppet master standing in the shadows, manipulating the threads of destiny.
It all began with an alarm ringing in a peaceful residential area where a family murder had occurred. The victim was a father, brutally murdered by his own son. The police arrived at the scene, enveloped by an eerie silence, broken only by the whistling wind through broken windows and the pungent smell of blood. The son, in a state of extreme panic, still holding the weapon, repeatedly pleaded and raged about liberation from an invisible ghost. What was remarkable was the method of the crime. The victim was cornered, the wounds indicating an explosive, accumulated violence, not an impulsive act. This brought to mind other domestic violence cases that investigators had known, but they couldn't yet name that strange familiarity. Less than a few weeks later, a similar case occurred in another neighborhood, hundreds of kilometers away. This time, a husband murdered his wife. The perpetrator committed suicide immediately afterward, leaving a suicide note full of bitter words about confinement, suffering, and the desire for an end. Once again, the method of the crime, the perpetrator's last words, and even the heavy atmosphere enveloping the scene, all had astonishing similarities to the previous case. Both perpetrators had a history of childhood abuse, having been victims of the very people they later tormented. However, there was no social, geographical, or professional connection between these two families. They were just separate individuals, unexpectedly drawn into the exact same spiral of violence. Similar cases continued to appear, scattered but alarming, in many different places. A mother harming her children, a child lashing out against their guardian, all bore a terrifying behavioral fingerprint. Criminal behavioral analysts began to notice a disturbing pattern. Each case reflected a cycle of violence that had existed in the perpetrator's family from the previous generation. They had once been victims of control, humiliation, or physical violence, and now they were reenacting that very behavior with their loved ones, sometimes with the same words, the same expressions, the same despair.
Police were initially perplexed. They thought these were just isolated incidents, individual tragedies. But deeper criminal psychologists saw a larger, more terrifying picture. They began to ask, is there something activating these chains of violence? Is it just a coincidence of damaged souls, or is there an invisible hand pulling the strings, activating these psychological time bombs? The family records of the perpetrators were meticulously reviewed. Investigators delved into medical histories, school records, witness statements from relatives, all the details of the perpetrators' childhoods. They discovered a horrifying truth. All these perpetrators grew up in an environment rife with conflict, manipulation, and latent or overt violence. They carried deep emotional scars from their early years.
These scars didn't heal, but smoldered, waiting for a spark to ignite. Pressure mounted on the investigators. They were facing an enemy without a face, without a name, yet capable of wreaking destruction by stirring up the deepest human pains. The fear was not just of death, but of the distortion of love, of family relationships, and of how psychological wounds could turn a person into a monster. The community began to panic, wondering if these tragedies could happen in their own families, if one day old scars suddenly reopened. As experts began to connect the psychological pieces, they noticed another alarming commonality. All these families had participated in workshops or read online materials about family conflict resolution or healing past trauma. It seemed this puppet master wasn't just seeking out individuals with a history of abuse, but also those who were trying to confront it, those seeking help. It was as if he was waiting for the most vulnerable souls to inject his venom. And then an anonymous email was sent to an investigative journalist containing deep psychological analyses of the cases and a strange theory about the inheritance of violent behavior. Along with it was a link to a specialized blog where the author, an anonymous person, regularly posted articles on psychological and sociological research, particularly on the intergenerational cycle of violence. These articles were not only academic, but also had a cold, almost indifferent tone, treating people as experimental subjects. This was a glimmer of light, but also a door opening to a new abyss.
The appearance of the anonymous blog, with its chilling analyses of the inheritance of violence, opened a whole new investigative direction and also a door to another terrifying level of crime. These were no longer isolated personal tragedies, but a staged drama, a morbid experiment controlled by an unseen perpetrator. The investigative team, in coordination with criminal psychologists and data analysts, began to track the digital footprint of the blog's author, hoping to find the person behind the curtain. Tracking the blog author was not easy. This individual was a master of anonymity and digital security, using proxy servers, virtual private networks, and complex encryption methods to hide their identity. Every time they thought they had a lead, it led to another dead end. Clearly, this person not only had deep knowledge of psychology, but also expertise in technology and the ability to plan meticulously and coldly. Meanwhile, similar domestic violence cases continued to occur, though not frequently, but enough to sustain fear and reinforce the hypothesis of a puppet master. Each new case had terrifying parallels with previous ones, not only in the method of the crime, but also in the psychological profile of the perpetrator. All had a history of abuse, all had been victims in their own families, and all exploded in violence when they reached a certain psychological threshold. Data analysts spent hundreds of hours sifting through online forums, psychological support groups, and social media sites. They looked for individuals with a history of family trauma, those seeking help or expressing despair. The goal was to identify how this puppet master approached and influenced their subjects. They discovered a series of anonymous accounts using academic but suggestive language, regularly interacting with these individuals.
These accounts would offer credible advice, guiding victims to research materials on the cycle of violence and gradually implanting in their minds the notion of the inevitability of breaking that cycle by retaliation or by becoming stronger.
This puppet master had built a sophisticated network of psychological manipulation. He did not directly order or incite violence. Instead, he provided a distorted conceptual framework, a morbid theory of liberation through reenacting what they had experienced. He provided victims with words to interpret their pain, but then turned those words into tools for destruction. For example, one perpetrator, who had been a child subjected to yelling and beatings, after interacting with this puppet master, began to speak of the need to establish control and breaking the shackles of weakness, phrases directly echoing the anonymous blog posts. A significant breakthrough occurred when the investigative team discovered a small social psychology research group specializing in intergenerational trauma psychology that had abruptly ceased operations a few years prior. The head of this research group was a young, promising, but extremely mysterious psychologist named Dr. Elias Vance. Vance had a tragic childhood, growing up in a severely abusive family, but then rose to become an excellent scholar, specializing in the very field in which he was once a victim. Upon delving deeper into Vance, they discovered that he had a perfect academic record, but also eccentric social behaviors and an excessive obsession with proving his theories. He had been criticized for unethical research methods, delving too deeply into subjects' personal lives, and using psychological concepts too coldly and mechanically. Vance had left academia after a minor scandal involving the leak of sensitive patient data, but no one knew where he had gone or what he had been doing since. The correlation between Vance's research topics and the content on the anonymous blog was too clear to ignore. In particular, there was an old video from a workshop Vance had attended, where he passionately presented on empirical research on the repetition of the cycle of violence, emphasizing that the only way to understand a problem is to become a part of it or to recreate it in a controlled manner. His eyes in that video exuded a chilling, sharp coldness, a superhuman intellect, but also a detachment from human emotion. Police believed that Dr. Elias Vance was the puppet master. He did not directly commit the crimes, but was an architect of suffering, a remote mind controller. He had turned personal pains into a morbid scientific project, using his deep knowledge of human psychology to push vulnerable individuals to the brink, causing them to reenact the tragedies they had once endured. To Vance, these deaths and acts of violence were not crimes, but valuable data, proof of his theory of the inheritance of violence, a way for him to expose the truth about family scars that society often ignored. He believed he was exposing a bigger problem, disregarding the lives and families ruined by his manipulation.
The morbid theory. As the pieces gradually connected, the portrait of Dr. Elias Vance emerged clearly and terrifyingly. He was not a direct perpetrator, but an architect of pain, a spreader of destruction through theory and remote psychological manipulation. Deeper analysis into Vance's past and research revealed a morbid picture of his motives. Vance was born and raised in a family that seemed normal on the surface, but deep within was a hidden cycle of violence. He had witnessed family members endure control, harsh words, and covert physical violence. These psychological scars did not lead him to seek escape, but instead turned into an academic obsession. He believed that violence was not just a behavior, but a form of programming, passed down from generation to generation, a legacy shaping destiny. Throughout his career, Vance pursued a bold but controversial theory, the theory of inherited violent behavior. He argued that, like genetic inheritance, patterns of violence and psychological trauma could also be transmitted across generations, not only through social learning, but also through deeper, unconscious psychological mechanisms. He was obsessed with proving this theory scientifically, regardless of ethics or consequences. His former colleagues once considered his ideas genius but terrifying, and had shunned him after he proposed experiments that crossed ethical boundaries.
Based on the evidence gathered from the anonymous blog and Vance's online interactions, investigators and psychological experts reconstructed the scenario he had orchestrated. Vance did not seek out completely undirected individuals. He targeted individuals with a history of family trauma, those in a vulnerable state, seeking understanding or solutions to their pain. He found them on support forums, online therapy groups, or places where they openly shared their turbulent pasts. After identifying potential subjects, Vance began his manipulation process. He approached them under various anonymous identities, expressing deep empathy for their pain, making them feel understood. Then he would gradually introduce his research materials, the blog posts and fabricated scientific works about the inevitable cycle of violence and the necessity of breaking that cycle by acting. He used powerful language, compelling stories, and sharp analyses to implant in the victims' minds the notion that they could not escape their fate unless they themselves became stronger, reenacting the violence to end their weakness.
Vance never directly ordered them to harm others. He only provided a distorted cognitive framework, a belief system in which their own violent behavior was justified as liberation, necessity, or even proof of his theory. He would closely monitor each victim's psychological progression, offering advice that seemed objective but was actually provocative, pushing them to the brink of explosion. For example, he might suggest that the victim's anger was a sign that the cycle is repeating, and the only way to break it is to confront it decisively. The terrifying thing was that Vance succeeded. He turned damaged individuals into perpetrators, reenacting their own family tragedies. Each case was not just a crime, but horrifying proof of his theory. He viewed these deaths not as tragedies, but as empirical data to prove his point about the inheritance of violence. In his worldview, he was not a murderer, but a scientist exposing a harsh truth of society. Someone conducting research using methods no one dared to imagine. In the encrypted research drafts later decoded by police, Vance meticulously recorded each reaction of his subjects. He analyzed the increase in hostile emotions, the change in behavior, and finally the violent outburst. He considered these successes, living proof of his theory. The chilling and objective coldness in his description of these tragedies made investigators shudder. Vance had no remorse. He only had the satisfaction of a researcher who had proven his hypothesis, regardless of the cost of countless lives and broken families. He was a sharp intellect twisted by personal obsession, turning knowledge into a tool of destruction. Confronting academic darkness. With the ever-mounting evidence, though mostly indirect and psychological, the investigative team had enough grounds to act. The goal was not just to apprehend Dr. Elias Vance, but also to expose his entire sophisticated manipulation network, preventing other family tragedies from erupting under his influence. However, confronting a sharp intellect, a psychological master like Vance, was not easy. He was not a typical killer, he was an architect of thought, and this confrontation would be a battle of wits. To avoid alerting Vance, investigators decided to approach him cautiously, under the guise of a specialized psychology workshop on intergenerational trauma and behavioral responses, a topic Vance was once obsessed with. They wanted him to walk into a trap he wouldn't suspect, a place where he felt recognized and could manipulate. A seasoned investigator, also a psychology expert, was assigned to play the main speaker, with the task of posing questions and hypotheses provocative enough for Vance to reveal himself. Vance appeared. He maintained a calm, intellectual demeanor, his sharp eyes sweeping the auditorium. He sat in the front row, listening intently, sometimes nodding or smirking dismissively at what he considered superficial analysis. The workshop was tense, not because of the topic, but because of his presence, like an invisible ghost hidden in the crowd. As the speaker began to delve into cases of domestic violence with strange coincidences, Vance's eyes began to light up in a unique way. During the Q&A session, Vance was the first to raise his hand. His voice was deep, confident, but carried a chilling coldness. He didn't ask a question, but offered a sharp rebuttal, criticizing traditional theories of domestic violence and proposing a different, superior perspective, his theory of the inheritance of violent behavior. He used complex terminology, logical analyses that many in the audience nod in agreement, even if they didn't fully grasp the dark implications behind it. He was unaware that his every word was being recorded and analyzed in detail. The dialogue between the speaker and Vance gradually became an open intellectual duel. The speaker, with the help of the team behind them, continuously posed counter-questions and specific cases to test Vance, forcing him to reveal more of his thinking.
Vance, with his immense narcissistic ego, fell into the trap. He couldn't resist the temptation to showcase his superior intellect. He began to delve into details that only the puppet master could know. How psychological scars from childhood reactivated violent behavior. The trigger words that could push someone to the brink. And the liberation he believed he had brought to the perpetrators by helping them break the cycle. He even referred to his empirical data, his living proof for his theory. Although he didn't directly name the victims or the cases, his descriptions of case studies chillingly coincided with the tragedies that had occurred. His eyes in those moments were not those of an objective scientist, but of a morbid creator, an artist of pain reveling in his work. Towards the end of the workshop, as Vance was enthusiastically presenting on new advances in understanding the cycle of violence, the Special Forces team was ready. Just as he was about to leave, they approached him, not with a typical arrest warrant, but with an invitation to discuss his theories further. Vance, still engrossed in his self-satisfaction, offered no resistance. He believed he was about to be taken to a place where his intellect would be even more highly valued. However, when he was led to a real interrogation room instead of a professional conference room, a fleeting surprise appeared on his face. In that room, there were no admiring spectators, only cold lights and the stern faces of the investigators. They began to present concrete evidence. The anonymous emails he had sent, the traced IP addresses, and most importantly, the painful testimonies of the victims who had fortunately escaped his control. The whispers about the master's theory that Vance had implanted in their minds.
Vance still tried to remain calm, initially denying, then attempting to steer the conversation towards an academic direction, portraying himself as a victim of misunderstanding. But as the investigators began to introduce small details, specialized terms that only he and the manipulated victims would know, Vance gradually lost control. His arrogance was replaced by a cold fury. He had no remorse. He was only angry that his great work was being misunderstood and destroyed by mediocre people. This was not an interrogation to elicit a confession. This was an ideological confrontation, where law enforcement had to face a distorted intellect, a person who believed he was serving a higher purpose, regardless of the cost of other people's lives and minds. Vance did not break down in the usual way. He still believed in his theory, still saw the investigators as incapable of understanding his vision. He was a genius who fell into the black hole of academic delusion and morbid ego. The legacy of distortion and conclusion. The confrontation with Dr. Elias Vance concluded. He was arrested, but it was not the end of a typical hunt. This was a bitter victory, because the perpetrator was not subdued by fear or remorse, but by the very arrogance of his morbid intellect. Vance never admitted to being a criminal. He remained steadfast in his role as a researcher who had proven his theory in the cruelest and most unethical way possible. The verdict for Vance was based not only on indirect evidence of his psychological manipulation, but also on a combination of in-depth behavioral analysis and the painful testimonies of victims who fortunately escaped his control.
They, who were once obsessed with true crime, now became living proof of the danger of allowing a morbid theory to possess the mind. Their recovery was a long and challenging journey, because they had to fight not only the fear from imprisoned memories, but also the very ideas and beliefs that Vance had instilled in them. In-depth analysis of the perpetrator's psychology, Dr. Elias Vance. Dr. Elias Vance is an extremely complex and terrifying case of the intersection between superior intellect and severe psychological disorder. He was not a common murderer. His motives were not personal hatred, material desire, or pure violent instinct. Academic obsession and need for proof. The core of Vance's psychology was his obsession with his inherited violent behavior theory. He was captivated by the idea that trauma and violence could be passed from generation to generation like an invisible gene. The need to prove this transcended all ethical and humanitarian boundaries. He viewed his victims and their tragedies merely as empirical data to bolster his hypothesis. This is a form of criminal behavior rationalization where he transformed brutal acts into a scientific project.
Lack of empathy and irresponsibility, especially a complete lack of empathy. He was unable to feel the pain of those he indirectly destroyed. Conscience did not exist in his worldview. Every action was justified by a higher scientific goal. He felt no guilt seeing families torn apart or individuals ruined, but even felt satisfied that these events confirmed his theory. Superiority complex and academic narcissism. Vance believed himself to be a misunderstood genius, someone capable of seeing truths that society and other scientists could not or dared not face. His ego was nourished by his ability to manipulate other people's minds and predict their behavior. He craved recognition not just as a scholar, but as an architect of thought, someone capable of reshaping human perception. The recognition from his brainwashed victims was a gruesome testament to that narcissistic ego. Although Vance was a victim of domestic violence in his childhood, instead of seeking healing, he chose to turn pain into a tool of destruction. He internalized and distorted his experiences, believing that violence was an unavoidable legacy, and the only way to control it was to become the one who controlled that cycle. This indicates a morbid coping mechanism, where untreated trauma transformed a brilliant mind into a tool for wreaking havoc. Exclusive worldview. Vance operated within his own worldview, where his theory was absolute truth. Anyone who did not accept or understand his vision was considered short-sighted, unworthy. This made him dangerous, as he would never waver or doubt his actions, no matter how dire the consequences. Social response and conclusion. The case of Dr. Elias Vance created a profound shockwave, not only in the legal community, but also in academia and society in general. It forced us to confront uncomfortable questions about the ethical boundaries in scientific research, about the responsibility of those with knowledge and power, and about the potential danger when a brilliant mind is distorted by obsession and a morbid ego. For those in psychology and sociology, this case was a harsh warning about the ethical use of knowledge.
It emphasized that deep understanding of human psychology can be a powerful tool for healing, but can also become a weapon of destruction if it falls into the wrong hands. In the community, fear was no longer just about random murderers, but about a new type of criminal, mind manipulators, people who could activate the darkness in the souls of the most vulnerable individuals. Vance's story reminds us that scars from the past, especially domestic violence, can leave persistent and dangerous legacies, not only for the victims, but also for society, if not properly identified and healed. Ultimately, this case is a chilling indictment of a corrupted intellect, a person who believed he was liberating others by pushing them into the very abyss of tragedy. It is a reminder that unhealed pains can proliferate into brutal acts, and that the ghost of domestic violence can haunt and resurface in the most terrifying ways, if someone like Vance is behind it, inheriting and amplifying that pain into a deadly symphony.